At 73, Meryl Streep has broken her silence. For decades, she was Hollywood's quiet titan, disciplined, revered, and untouchable. But behind the accolades and applause was a truth she never dared speak. Until now. From backstage betrayals to battles with co-stars who challenged her craft and crossed unforgivable lines, Streep is finally naming names and setting the record straight. It's not revenge, it's revelation. What we all suspected. She was never just acting. She was enduring. And now she's done protecting egos. Meryl Streep is reclaiming the story the industry tried to silence. And it's nothing like we imagined. The slap heard around the industry. Meryl Streep's breakout role in Kramer vs. Kramer, 1979, wasn't just a career milestone. It was an emotional ambush. At just 30 years old, still grieving the death of her fiancé John Cazale, Meryl arrived on set, raw but ready. It was her first major film, and she was paired with one of Hollywood's biggest stars, Dustin Hoffman. What she didn't expect was that her co-star would blur the lines between art and cruelty. During her very first take, Hoffman slapped her, unscripted and without warning. That moment stunned everyone on set. But Hoffman wasn't done. In a later scene, he smashed a wine glass just inches from her face, sending shards flying. It was another attempt to elicit a real reaction. In the film's pivotal courtroom scene, he leaned in and whispered John Cazale into her ear, moments before the cameras rolled. He knew that name was sacred, her recent, devastating loss. To Hoffman, it was method. To Meryl, it was emotional sabotage. For years, Meryl said nothing. She maintained grace in interviews, even as Hoffman collected praise for his raw performance. But in 2018, during an interview with the New York Times, Meryl finally acknowledged what had happened. It was overstepping, she said of the slap. At 73, she wasn't protecting reputations anymore. She was calling out what had long been excused. The weaponization of grief, of trauma, of method acting gone too far. The secret? That iconic performance wasn't born of collaboration. It was born of violated boundaries and quiet endurance. Streep's silence wasn't weakness. It was survival. And after decades of being called a genius, she's finally letting the world see what it cost her to earn that title. But Dustin Hoffman wasn't the only acting giant who tested her limits. Just a few years later, Meryl would find herself locked in another kind of battle. Not with physical aggression, but with artistic disregard. And this time, the pain came not from personal attacks, but from being quietly undermined by a co-star who didn't believe in her method or her discipline. Kevin Kline and the Breakdown of Respect. In 1982, Meryl Streep starred in what many consider her greatest role, Sophie's Choice. She spent months preparing, mastering a Polish accent so precisely that even native speakers were impressed. She learned German, studied Holocaust survivor testimonies, and physically transformed her body. She wasn't playing Sophie, she became Sophie, but her co-star, Kevin Kline, had a different approach. To him, acting was jazz, loose, spontaneous, instinctual. And it clashed with Meryl's architecture. Their dynamic on set was professional, but tense. During rehearsals, Kline reportedly joked that her accent was so technically brilliant, it's distracting. He may have meant it as a compliment, but to Meryl, it felt dismissive. What you call distracting, I call essential, she fired back. It wasn't just about technique, it was about respect. She had built this character brick by brick, and now her scene partner was calling it too much. The friction never exploded into arguments, but it hovered over every scene. Director Alan J. Pakula had to navigate the chilly distance between his two leads. Even as their on-screen chemistry mesmerized audiences, Kline's improvisation often forced Meryl to recalibrate in real time. To viewers, their tension looked like passion. In truth, it was two different philosophies of acting grinding against each other, take after take. The secret? Meryl never worked with Kevin Kline again. She never publicly criticized him, but she never praised him either. Years later, when asked about Sophie's choice, she credited the script, the director, the crew, but not her co-star. The silence was intentional. Not all betrayals are loud. Some just echo in the spaces where praise should have been. Meryl didn't need actors to agree with her, but she needed them to respect the work. And when that respect wasn't returned, she remembered. But the next actor she clashed with didn't just disrespect the process. He embodied everything Meryl feared about stardom. He was unpredictable, seductive, and utterly uninterested in the kind of truth Meryl believed in. And the result wasn't just artistic tension. It was philosophical warfare on set. Jack Nicholson. By the time Meryl Streep teamed up with Jack Nicholson in Heartburn, 1986, both actors were at the peak of their powers. She had just won 2 Oscars. He had 3. The pairing was a dream for studios, but a slow-burn disaster behind the scenes. Jack didn't build characters, he channeled them. He walked onto set as Jack, winked at the crew, improvised a few lines, and called it brilliance. For Meryl, who came to set with notebooks, historical research, and psychological profiles, it felt like a mockery of the craft. Their chemistry on screen looked effortless, but behind the camera, Meryl was fending off flirtation, improvisation, and unpredictability. Jack teased. He pressed. He blurred boundaries. According to author Aaron Carlson, Meryl confided in director Mike Nichols that she felt unsafe, not physically, but artistically. "He's not doing the work," she reportedly said, and that, to her, was the gravest sin an actor could commit. Even after Heartburn, they reunited for Ironweed, 1987. But the distance between them had solidified. There were no shared laughs between takes, no bonding over scenes, just cold professionalism. Jack continued being Jack. Meryl buried herself in the character. Their scenes were technically flawless and completely devoid of intimacy. The secret? Meryl never considered Jack a true collaborator. She respected his talent, but believed he coasted on persona. When asked years later about actors who refused to disappear into their roles, Meryl said, "Some critics can't accept that Santa Claus is just a man in a beard." It wasn't just a quip, it was a scalpel, and everyone knew who it cut. With Nicholson, the fight was philosophical, but the next clash was more subtle and more recent. It happened on a light-hearted comedy. No trauma, no tragedy, just 2 actors trying to make laughter from life. But for Meryl, comedy required as much precision as drama. And when her scene partner turned every moment into a playground, she realized that chaos, even when charming, can still be a form of disrespect. Alec Baldwin. In 2009, Meryl Streep starred opposite Alec Baldwin in It's Complicated, a romantic comedy that looked light on the surface, but underneath, a quiet creative battle was brewing. Baldwin came from a world of improvisation, charm, and comedic looseness. Meryl, as always, approached the role with structure, intention, and weeks of preparation. From day one, their styles clashed. Baldwin often rewrote lines in the middle of takes or added jokes off script. "He was riffing like he was on 30 Rock," said one crew member. Meryl, who had rehearsed emotional beats down to the breath, was forced to adapt in real time. On camera, it looked spontaneous. Behind the scenes, she was quietly exasperated. According to insiders, she asked for multiple reshoots, more rehearsal time, and tighter scene blocking, something almost unheard of for a rom-com. Despite the tension, Baldwin publicly praised her. "Working with Meryl is like playing tennis with Serena Williams," he told Entertainment Weekly. But the praise was hollow. Meryl knew when an actor was adapting, and when they were just winging it. "You build the truth from the inside," she said in one post-release interview. "The rest is noise." It wasn't shade. It was a line in the sand. The secret: Streep never asked to work with Baldwin again. Their chemistry sold tickets, but their creative values were fundamentally incompatible. Baldwin called it a dream. Meryl called it work. And for an actress who viewed every role as sacred labor, Baldwin's spontaneity wasn't thrilling. It was chaos she had to clean up. Meryl could forgive chaos. What she couldn't forgive was condescension. And in her quietest feud, that's exactly what she felt. No shouting, no backstabbing, just a cold shoulder delivered through silence. The next actress didn't hurt her with behavior. She hurt her with symbolism. Because sometimes, a win isn't a celebration. It's a warning sign that the craft is changing, and not for the better. Gwyneth Paltrow. The 1999 Academy Awards became one of the most controversial nights in acting history. Not for scandal, but for symbolism. Gwyneth Paltrow, just 26 years old, won the Best Actress Oscar for Shakespeare in Love, beating Meryl's deeply praised performance in One True Thing. In the theater that night, Meryl didn't clap. She didn't smile. She didn't even look at the stage. That moment became folklore. Meryl, the seasoned legend, had lost to someone the press dubbed Hollywood royalty. Gwyneth's win wasn't just a trophy. It was seen by many as a changing of the guard. But to Meryl, it felt like a betrayal. A recognition of celebrity over character, charm over craft. She made no public comment, no statement of congratulations. And most notably, she avoided every event where Gwyneth was scheduled to appear for the next 2 years. Later, when asked about young actors in Hollywood, Streep replied, "I worry that presence is replacing performance, that charisma is being confused with preparation." It was never confirmed as a jab, but the subtext was clear. In a town full of subtext, it landed like thunder. Even Alec Baldwin, who had worked with both women, joked privately, "Meryl memorizes the phone book. Gwyneth memorizes the vibes." The real heartbreak? Gwyneth admired Meryl. She reportedly sent handwritten notes, tagged her in social media praise, and once called her the reason I became an actress. But Meryl never responded, because to her, it wasn't personal. It was philosophical. And for someone who had built her legacy brick by brick, the idea of awards being handed out for trend or lineage was almost unforgivable. The secret: Meryl didn't hate Gwyneth. She resented what her win represented. And while the world moved on, she held that silence, not as spite, but as principle. Not all feuds are about ego. Some are about ideals, about what deserves to be honored and what doesn't. But Meryl's next conflict wasn't with a younger actress or a tabloid headline. It was with someone who, on paper, should have been her equal. A man as respected as she was, as intellectual, as prepared. But when their philosophies collided in one unmade film, the chill it left behind was colder than any slap or silence she'd faced before. Jeremy Irons. In the early 2000s, Meryl Streep and Jeremy Irons were attached to a period drama about political betrayal and emotional repression. It never got made. But the rehearsals, those few weeks in London, behind closed doors, left behind one of Streep's most quietly haunting memories. On paper, they were a perfect match. Both classically trained, both known for depth, both intellectual giants. But artistry, as it turned out, wasn't enough. Jeremy treated performance like orchestration, crisp, controlled, elegant. Meryl treated it like excavation, messy, detailed, lived in. According to a dialect coach on the project, Irons once quipped that Meryl's accent work felt like auditioning for best technique rather than playing a person. It wasn't meant to wound, but it did. Meryl responded quietly but firmly. If you think technique and truth are enemies, you're not listening. You're performing at people, not with them. From that moment, the room froze. Their rehearsals became transactional. No eye contact, no sidebar chats. The collaboration, what little was left of it, faded fast. Producers began looking for replacements. Within 3 weeks, the project was shelved, and both stars walked away. Neither ever mentioned it publicly. Years later, Jeremy told The Guardian, "Meryl is extraordinary, no doubt, but sometimes the performance dazzles so much, it overshadows the story." It wasn't a slight, but it wasn't admiration either. And Meryl? She said nothing. Just once, in a round table, she praised actors who surrender ego in service of the truth. Those in the know heard the echo. The secret? This wasn't a feud. It was a cold war of artistic integrity. No headlines, no scandal, just two titans whose brilliance made them incompatible. These stories, some subtle, some shattering, show the quiet cost of a career built on discipline. For decades, Meryl stayed silent, choosing craft over confrontation. But in the changing winds of Hollywood, that silence began to feel like complicity. And at 73, she made a decision. Not to relive old wounds, but to expose the truths behind the genius. Because some stories deserve to be told, especially when they come from the most careful storyteller of all. Why she stayed silent for so long. For over 4 decades, Meryl Streep stayed quiet about the on-set violations, artistic clashes, and quiet humiliations she endured. It wasn't out of fear, it was out of strategy. In Hollywood's 1980s and 1990s, speaking out meant being labeled difficult. And for a woman, especially one with ambition, that label was professional death. Meryl wasn't about to let anyone take her career from her. In her early interviews, she stuck to script. She praised co-stars, thanked directors, smiled through questions that tiptoed toward controversy. But behind that grace was a woman navigating an industry built to protect male genius at the expense of everyone else's boundaries. And so she made a choice: to survive first, speak later. She gave stunning performances. She collected 21 Oscar nominations, and she let her work do the talking. But time changed things. As the culture began to shift, especially after 2017, with the rise of #MeToo, Meryl began to reevaluate the silence she'd carried for so long. In interviews, she started dropping phrases like emotional overstepping and boundaries weren't respected. She didn't name names at first, but those who knew the stories could read between the lines. At 73, Meryl finally started confirming what fans had long suspected: that behind the controlled performances and elegant speeches was a woman who had endured far more than the public ever knew. And now, she was ready to tell the truth, not to settle scores, but to clear the record. Because silence had protected others for too long, and it was never hers to carry in the first place. But when Meryl spoke, she didn't do it with rage. She did it with precision. And perhaps the most surprising revelation of all came not in anger, but in forgiveness. Because some wounds, even the deepest ones, lose their sting over time. And for one former co-star, the man who had once humiliated her on her first film, it wasn't redemption that came next. It was something stranger, quieter, and more complex. Forgiveness or closure. In 2020, Meryl Streep appeared on The Jonathan Ross Show, where she was asked, almost casually, about her time working with Dustin Hoffman. For a moment, the audience held its breath. Would she finally speak freely? Would she name the pain? What followed wasn't explosive. It was hauntingly calm. "All is forgiven," she said, before adding, "But boy, I was mad that day." She didn't elaborate. She didn't need to. That small moment said everything. Meryl had reached peace, not because Hoffman had apologized, but because she no longer needed him to. He had once crossed a line she never invited him to. And now, over 40 years later, she was done carrying the memory like a wound. But forgiveness didn't mean friendship. They never worked together again. There were no public reunions, no onstage tributes. The boundary Meryl had drawn back in 1979 remained intact. Even at Hollywood events, they were never photographed side by side. Not once. The secret? Forgiveness was never about him. It was about her. About letting herself own the story instead of letting others write it. And in doing so, she reclaimed something she had lost on that very first film, her voice. But Hoffman was just one chapter. Over the decades, a pattern had formed, one that painted a broader picture of who Meryl was and what she believed. It wasn't about grudges or gossip. It was about the deeper divide in her industry, a battle between ego and discipline, charm and craft, persona and process. And that war, Meryl had been quietly fighting for a lifetime. The method versus the myth. Across her career, Meryl Streep repeatedly clashed, not just with individuals but with a culture, one that prized improvisation over preparation, that rewarded chaos as brilliance and dismissed technique as cold. She saw it in Jack Nicholson, in Alec Baldwin, in Jeremy Irons, all men who shaped scenes to their liking, who performed themselves as much as their characters. Meryl didn't play herself. She built roles like architecture. She researched. She obsessed. She rehearsed. And because of that, she often found herself opposite actors who viewed her process as excessive, even unnecessary. But Meryl knew what it took to make greatness look effortless. And she also knew the price of being dismissed as too serious. Time after time, critics raved about her performances but downplayed the effort. They talked about her being technically perfect, as if it were a flaw. But perfection wasn't her goal. Truth was. And truth, she knew, came from sacrifice, not swagger. The secret? Meryl wasn't fighting people. She was fighting a myth. The myth that genius is spontaneous, that the best acting happens by accident. She stood for another truth, that mastery is method, that art is labor, and that no one should have to apologize for giving everything they have to their craft. Meryl Streep never set out to be a rebel. She just wanted to act. But in the process of protecting her work, she became a quiet revolutionary. And now, as she enters the twilight of her career, she's passing that lesson on. Not just through roles, but through honesty, through warning, through legacy. the legacy she wants to leave behind. At 73, Meryl Streep stands as the most decorated actor of her generation, with 3 Oscars, 8 Golden Globes, and over 100 film credits. But she's no longer interested in awards. What matters now is what her story teaches, not just about acting, but about surviving in an industry that often mistakes brilliance for bravado. She wants young women to know they can say no to improvisation that crosses lines, to praise that comes with condescension, to co-stars who treat preparation like a flaw. "You don't need to become someone else to be great," she said. "You just need to do the work." These stories she's begun to tell, they're not revenge. They're reflections. Reminders that even the most graceful careers are built on battles the audience never sees. And they're not meant to tarnish the past, but to light the path forward. The secret? Meryl Streep isn't just protecting her legacy. She's protecting the craft itself. Because for her, acting was never about fame. It was about truth. And now, finally, she's telling hers. Meryl Streep's story was never just about greatness. It was about survival in an industry that glorified charisma but undervalued craft. At 73, she's done smiling politely through discomfort, done nodding along to questions that overlook the complexity of her truth. She's lifting the curtain, not for spectacle, but for clarity. Because what's been revealed in these late-life confessions isn't scandal. It's legacy. For years, Streep carried the unspoken weight of compromise. She endured slaps masked as method, dismissive co-stars who mocked her preparation, and press tours that forced her to praise men who, behind the scenes, undermined her work. And she did it all while delivering some of the most unforgettable performances in cinematic history. But now, she's owning what it took to create those roles. The tension behind the takes, the silence after the cameras stopped rolling, the emotional toll of working in a system that treated her discipline as cold and her boundaries as inconvenient. When she reveals that Dustin Hoffman slapped her in Kramer vs. Kramer without warning, it's not about headlines, it's about naming a culture. One that called cruelty genius and expected women to thank it for the opportunity. Her feud with Kevin Kline wasn't loud, but it was cutting. A single offhand comment about her accent work being distracting sent a message that echoed across her career. Preparation was optional for men, but overkill for women. Her discomfort with Jack Nicholson, her exasperation with Alec Baldwin, her cool distance from Gwyneth Paltrow, it all adds up to one truth. Meryl Streep has spent 5 decades walking a tightrope between artistic excellence and emotional labor. She doesn't tell these stories to burn bridges. She tells them to build guardrails for the next generation of women who want to act, create, lead, and do so without sacrificing their safety or self-respect. Because it's not just about how she was treated, it's about what it means when someone like Meryl Streep can be dismissed, disrespected, or quietly manipulated, and no one speaks up until she does it herself. And still, in classic Streep fashion, she finds grace in the telling. She doesn't scream, she doesn't slander. She speaks plainly, elegantly, truthfully. She forgives without forgetting. She protects her craft without shaming those who failed to respect it. And that may be her most radical act yet. Not the roles, not the awards, but the decision to finally let the world see her not as the impenetrable genius, but as the woman who earned every ounce of that brilliance at a cost few understood. Her words now are not a reckoning, they're a release, a permission slip for honesty, a masterclass in how to reclaim a story that once belonged to everyone but you. And as the industry evolves, her voice becomes more than a reflection. It becomes a foundation. Because the real legacy of Meryl Streep isn't just in the characters she played. It's in the silence she endured and the courage it took to finally break it. She's not asking for sympathy. She doesn't need it. She's giving a gift. A map, a mirror, a message. At 73, Meryl Streep has told us the truth. Now it's up to us to listen.